We all know those numbers weren't yours, you just copied my report and slapped your name on it. My colleague Ryan sneered across the open plan office. His voice pitched perfectly to cut through the hum of keyboards and the half-hearted laughter near the break room. And like clockwork, heads popped up over cubicle walls, eyes darting from him to me, their judgment already forming before I could even draw a breath to defend myself. The sting of humiliation burrowing into my chest, as if the fluorescent lights themselves had turned into spotlights designed to roast me alive in the middle of my workplace arena, and for a moment I stood there, frozen, coffee mug in hand. The cheap ceramic shaking just enough that the liquid inside rippled like a seismograph, recording the quakes of my shame, while the scent of burnt office coffee and stale printer toner felt sharper than any insult hurled at me in my 38 years of life. But I didn't let it break my face, didn't let it show that his words had hit a nerve so deep it was practically marrow. Because men like Ryan feed on cracks. They live for that moment you crumble, and I'd already learned once before that sometimes survival means holding still until you can strike clean, which I would, because unlike Ryan, I wasn't empty-handed in this war. I had something, a quiet advantage tucked away, one he would never see coming until it was too late. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Anyway, my name is Daniel Hayes. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in Akron, Ohio, now grinding it out in a mid-sized Chicago consulting firm, where ambition is currency and betrayal might as well be part of the onboarding package. And if I sound bitter, it's because bitterness is the natural aftertaste of busting your ass for over a decade, only to watch someone else get credit for your sweat. But this moment, Ryan's little public stunt, wasn't just about a stolen report or a cheap laugh at my expense. It was the beginning of something bigger. A story of sabotage and betrayal that would strip me down to my bones before I learned how to weaponize the very things they thought would destroy me. And yes, I'll admit right here at the start, there's a certain sick poetry to what came next. You see, I wasn't always the guy people whispered about at happy hour, oh, he used to be promising guy, no. I was the guy who stayed late, the guy who said yes when others groaned. The guy who learned every client quirk and kept files so detailed that colleagues called them Daniel's Bible, and maybe that pride in details was my curse, because when betrayal comes, it's never in broad daylight. It's in the overlooked detail, the hidden clause, the unchecked email that slips into your inbox at midnight. And while Ryan's cheap shot was the public explosion, the real bomb had been planted weeks before, quietly, carefully, while I was too busy believing loyalty still meant something in a world where everyone's got a knife under the table. That morning, after the humiliation, I walked straight to the break room, set my shaking mug down, and poured another cup of sludge that passed for coffee. Because sometimes a man clings to routine when the ground shifts beneath him. And as I stirred in the powdered creamer I hated, I caught my reflection in the microwave door. The tired eyes, the jawline my wife said looked stronger when I was angry. The flecks of gray creeping into my beard, and I whispered to myself something I've learned the hard way. Trust isn't given, it's rented, and rent always comes due. That's the first quotable lesson I'll hand you here, free of charge, because every man in his 30s or 40s who's been stabbed in the back will nod when he hears it, and every kid just starting out should tattoo it on their brain before they're blindsided. I carried my coffee back to my desk, slid into my chair, and scrolled through my emails like nothing had happened, but inside my mind was replaying every interaction with Ryan over the past 6 months. The forced camaraderie at the bar where he'd buy a round of cheap beers and talk about loyalty. The gym mornings where he'd slap my shoulder and say, "We're a team, brother." The sly jokes about how he'd cover for me if I ever missed a deadline. All of it just camouflage for the knife he was already sharpening. And I should have known from the way he looked at me when I landed the Hamilton account last quarter. The jealousy that flickered, even as his smile stayed plastered on, the kind of jealousy that doesn't fade. It festers, it metastasizes, and it eventually demands blood. My phone buzzed Slack notification. "Hey Daniel, can we talk in HR at 11? So my stomach dropped because nothing good ever comes from HR emails that vague. And sure enough, by 11 I was sitting across from Jessica, our HR manager, who slid a folder across the desk like it was evidence in a trial and said softly, "We've received a complaint about report attribution, Daniel." Her tone neutral but her eyes searching, gauging my reaction. And I realized with a bitter jolt that Ryan had not only set me up, he'd already filed the paperwork to back it. And I almost laughed because here was the truth of adulthood nobody tells you. The real battles aren't fought in boardrooms or bars. They're fought in HR offices where everyone smiles while holding a blade under the table. That's the second line I'll give you to remember. I denied it, of course, calmly, firmly, like a man who's been wrongly accused should, but in the back of my mind I wasn't panicking, not yet, because I had my quiet weapon, my overlooked detail, something Ryan hadn't considered, something I'd kept out of paranoia or maybe foresight, a digital paper trail that would matter more than his smug smirk. But patience was my currency now, timing my investment. Because revenge, real revenge, isn't about yelling louder, it's about letting the rope tighten on its own before you give the final pull. After the meeting, I walked outside into the cold Chicago air, the kind that slices your lungs and wakes you up better than caffeine. And I stood there watching people rush to lunch with their heads down, burritos and salads in hand, earbuds blocking the world. And I thought about how easy it is to be invisible in this city. How a man can be gutted in front of 100 coworkers and the world outside keeps spinning like nothing happened. And I promised myself right then, with the sting of humiliation still hot on my face, that I wouldn't be invisible. Not this time, not when betrayal had been planted so deep, and not when I had the tools to dig it out and make them choke on the dirt. And here's the last thing I'll leave you with in this opening chapter of my hell. Ambition will cost you friends, but betrayal will make you remember why you never needed them in the first place. And I swear to you, when this story ends, you'll understand exactly what I mean. The rest of that week crawled by like a bad dream you can't wake from. Each hour dripping humiliation in doses too small to kill you outright, but just enough to erode the edges of your confidence. And I swear every time I walked past Ryan's desk, I could feel his eyes on me, the smug weight of his new role as the unofficial storyteller of my downfall, whispering in corners, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. And the worst part wasn't even the whispers. It was the silence. The way people I'd once grabbed beers with after work now avoided eye contact, suddenly too busy to chat, too nervous to be associated with the guy under investigation, and I kept telling myself it was temporary, that truth would surface. But truth has this ugly habit of drowning when perception decides to hold it under, and perception was Ryan's playground, his weapon of choice, and he was using it like a seasoned executioner. At home, my wife Rachel tried to comfort me, but even she couldn't hide the flicker of doubt when I told her the accusations were fake. And I don't blame her, because in a marriage stretched thin by bills and long hours, trust becomes fragile glass, and one hard knock can send cracks racing across the whole pane. And though she wrapped her arms around me that Friday night, I could feel the stiffness in her shoulders, like she wasn't sure if she was holding on to her husband or a liar trying to spin a story. And that doubt hit me harder than anything Ryan could say, because losing your wife's faith is like losing oxygen. You can survive for a little while, but eventually you suffocate. Still, I kept my mask on. I kept going to the gym every morning at 6 like I always had, because in a world where control slips through your fingers, lifting iron plates and hearing them slam onto the rack gives you one pure moment of control. And even as I sweated through deadlifts with my old Cavs hoodie sticking to my back, I thought about how Ryan had once joined me here too, laughing about his lack of discipline. "Dude, I could never get up this early," he'd said. But now I saw those mornings for what they were: scouting missions, getting close enough to learn my habits, my weaknesses, my trust, and then weaponizing it all against me. There's a memory that sticks out: company Christmas party 2 years ago, when the partners handed me a bottle of Macallan whiskey with a little gold tag, "To Daniel, for the details no one else sees." And everyone clapped while I raised the bottle like a trophy, that bottle still sitting unopened on top of my fridge at home. A symbol of the one thing I thought couldn't be stolen from me: my reputation for thoroughness, for detail, for catching what others missed. But now here I was, accused of stealing someone else's work. The irony bitter enough to choke on, and every time I glanced at that bottle, I felt rage boil in my gut. Not just at Ryan, but at myself for ever believing colleagues were friends. Monday morning came with another gut punch, an email chain forwarded to me for transparency by HR Ryan's complaint, expanded now with attachments, screenshots of my report files, but twisted, cropped to make it look like his drafts predated mine. And I sat there in my cubicle, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, heart hammering as I opened each attachment, knowing exactly where the truth lived, but also realizing how convincing his illusion looked to anyone who wasn't inside my head. And for the first time, real panic clawed at me, because I understood then just how deep his sabotage ran. But here's the thing: details are my religion, and what Ryan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, is that I'd built a redundant cloud backup system months earlier, a habit born from paranoia after losing a client file once, and in that archive lived time-stamped versions of every draft, every late-night correction with my digital fingerprints all over them. And the thought of that secret gave me enough oxygen to keep breathing. Enough steel to keep my face neutral when HR said they'd be reviewing thoroughly. Because patience was my weapon and I wasn't ready to fire yet, not until he dangled himself high enough on his rope. Still, the waiting ate at me, and the humiliations piled on my access to the Hamilton client's shared drive quietly revoked for security. Colleagues CCING Ryan instead of me on calls. Even the office intern giving me a pitying glance, like I was some washed-up boxer staggering into the 10th round. And every sting left a scar I carved into memory, a ledger of debts I promised myself would be collected. The tension followed me home like smoke. Rachel asking why I didn't fight harder. My daughter Emma, 12 years old and sharp as a blade, asking why I seemed sad all the time, and I had no words for her because how do you explain to a child that adults don't just lie? They orchestrate, they design betrayals like blueprints, and sometimes the world rewards the saboteur while the honest man drowns? One night I sat in my car outside the house for an hour, engine idling, listening to the hollow tick of the heater and gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Because walking inside meant putting on a face for Rachel and Emma, and I didn't have the strength. And in that moment of exhaustion, I whispered a vow into the dark windshield. I won't just survive this. I'll bury him with his own lies. It wasn't bravado, it was survival instinct, the primal growl that comes when your back hits the wall, and I think every working man knows that place. The place where pride and fear blur, where you realize you can either collapse or sharpen your pain into a weapon. The next day, as if the universe wanted to test that vow, Ryan made his boldest move yet stood in the middle of the floor during a team huddle and casually mentioned how he was cleaning up the Hayes mess. As if I were already convicted, and laughter rippled, not cruel but relieved, like people were glad to have a narrative that let them move on without guilt. And I looked at each of their faces and felt something inside me shift, not break but crystallize, hard and clear. I wasn't fighting just to prove my innocence anymore. I was fighting to show every single person in that room that siding with betrayal has consequences, and that kind of fire doesn't burn out. It calcifies. It becomes the fuel that carries you through the long nights when your own family doubts you. And when Ryan glanced at me mid-sentence, smirking, I gave him nothing back, just a calm nod. Because sometimes the deadliest thing you can do to an enemy is let them believe they've already won. By the time January thawed into that slush-gray February that makes Chicago feel like the underworld itself, the investigation had dragged on long enough that even silence was an accusation, and I could feel it in every hallway glance, every polite half-smile that faded too fast, like my very presence had become an inconvenience. And the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity was the gym at 6 a.m., the clang of weights like punctuation marks against the fog in my brain, and those moments in the locker room when I'd sit with my headphones blasting some old metallic track and remind myself that rage, properly contained, is just energy waiting for the right channel. But outside those walls, the humiliation metastasized. HR meetings multiplied like weeds, each one framed as just gathering more context, but each one carrying the unspoken weight that maybe they were building a case for my exit. And every time Jessica slid another file across the table, I forced myself to scan it calmly, even when my hands itched to rip it to shreds, because I knew what she didn't know, that I had proof in my back pocket. Timestamps and file histories tucked in a cloud account that didn't bear the company's name, a digital insurance policy born out of paranoia that was about to become my ace. But holding that ace didn't stop the slow bleed of life outside the office. Rachel grew sharper in her questions, asking why I hadn't confronted Ryan directly, why I wasn't storming into the partner's office and demanding justice, and I told her it wasn't about theatrics. It was about timing, but I could see she didn't believe me, not entirely, and one night after Emma went to bed, she asked flat out if I had copied Ryan's report, her voice trembling with that awful blend of fear and suspicion, and I just stared at her for a long minute before saying, "If you can't trust me, then what the hell do we even have?" And the silence after that was colder than the February wind whipping outside our window. I'd always thought of betrayal as something external, a knife in the back. But the truth is, betrayal spreads like smoke. It seeps into the walls of your marriage, your friendships, your own sense of self, until you're choking on it at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe everyone else is right, and you really are the fraud they say you are. But then I'd glance at the unopened Macallan on top of the fridge, dust gathering on the gold tag, and remember that once I was valued for seeing details no one else saw, and that bottle became my anchor, My silent reminder that symbols matter because they tether you to who you used to be when the world tries to rewrite you. Meanwhile, Ryan flourished in the spotlight, his name popping up in email threads that used to be mine, his laugh echoing too loud in meetings, his just happy to step in where needed routine earning nods from people who should have known better. And I swear there were days I wanted to grab him by the collar and smash his face into the polished conference table just to wipe the smugness off. But here's the thing about revenge, it's like whiskey. You don't chug it, you let it breathe, you savor the burn, and then you deliver it when it hits hardest. My patience was tested when a client Hamilton himself, the man whose account had been my baby for nearly a year, called me directly one afternoon, his voice sharp as he said, "Daniel, what the hell is going on over there? Ryan just pitched me your strategy deck, but it was sloppy, incomplete, not what I expect from you." And in that moment, my blood ran cold because it confirmed what I'd suspected. Ryan wasn't just sabotaging me inside the firm, he was cannibalizing my work to climb, and worse, he was botching it, leaving my reputation tied to his incompetence. I wanted to tell Hamilton everything, to blow the whistle right then, but instead I bit my tongue, told him politely I'd look into it, and hung up with my jaw aching from the tension, because no matter how much I wanted to expose him, the timing still wasn't right. I needed Ryan to overreach, to hang himself on his own arrogance, and I could feel that moment coming the way you feel a storm pressing down on your bones. That night, sitting in the driveway again, engine ticking, I thought about every humiliation, every whisper, every doubtful look in Rachel's eyes, and I realized this story wasn't just about proving innocence. It was about something darker, something truer. I wanted him to feel the same slow suffocation I'd been living, to taste it until it curdled in his mouth. And then, when he thought he'd adjusted to the pain, I wanted to crush him with the detail he'd overlooked, the one I'd been nursing like a secret flame. And maybe that's what betrayal really does. It teaches you that justice isn't about fairness, it's about precision, about knowing when to press the blade and when to pull back. A week later, the partners called an all-hands meeting, the kind where everyone crams into the glass conference room with stale bagels and burnt coffee, and Ryan was front and center, running point on new client alignment strategy. And as he clicked through his slides, I saw my own phrasing, my own frameworks, butchered by his sloppy edits, and the sight almost made me laugh. Because, in his greed, he'd laid a breadcrumb trail straight to himself, and when the partners started frowning, asking questions he couldn't answer, I felt the first shift of the tide, subtle but real, like the moment a poker player realizes his opponent's bluff is unraveling. I sat there calm, sipping my bitter coffee, while inside my head I whispered to myself, "Every empire built on lies collapses under its own weight." And I knew the collapse had begun, even if no one else saw it yet. After the meeting, Ryan swaggered past my desk, muttering, "Enjoy the view from the sidelines, buddy." And I just smiled at him, a small, quiet smile that must have unnerved him because he frowned for the first time in weeks. And that was enough for me, because I knew part 2 was about to begin, the shift from survival to retaliation, from silence to precision. And though my world still looked broken on the surface, I had the detail he'd missed, the seed of procedural justice already germinating. And when it bloomed, it would strangle him, not me. The strange thing about betrayal is that after the initial explosion, life doesn't actually stop. It limps forward like a wounded animal, and the world expects you to clock in, send emails, pick up groceries, smile at your kid's science fair, all while bleeding internally, and that's exactly how March felt. A month of pretending I was fine while beneath the surface I was sharpening. And the irony was Ryan mistook my silence for defeat, which made him bolder, sloppier, and that's the paradox of saboteurs. They think once you're humiliated, you're finished, when really humiliation is just fuel for the long game. The Hamilton account began showing cracks. Clients complaining about missed follow-ups, strategy inconsistencies, and while Ryan smoothed over the issues with fake charm and buzzwords, I kept my head down, cataloging every mistake, every overlooked email timestamp, every corrupted attachment, storing them in a folder I titled Seed Corn, because that's what it was, the grain I plant, at the right moment to reap a harvest of truth. At home, though, the strain grew unbearable. Rachel's patience thinned into resentment. She accused me of hiding behind excuses, of being too passive, and one night she threw the unopened bottle of Macallan into the sink, the clang echoing like a gunshot, and shouted, "You keep staring at this like it's some damn trophy. But it's just a bottle of whiskey, Daniel. It's not going to save you." and the shards of glass glittered under the kitchen light while I stood frozen, chest hollow, because I'd never told her what it symbolized, how it anchored me, and now it was gone, shattered, a reminder that even symbols can be ripped away when the people closest to you stop believing. Emma overheard the fight and wouldn't look at me for days, her silence a knife sharper than anything Ryan could craft, and in those quiet hours I realized betrayal isn't confined to boardrooms. It infiltrates kitchens, bedrooms, even the look in your child's eyes, and that was the moment my pain hardened into something else, something weaponized, because I couldn't afford to just win anymore. I had to obliterate the lie so completely that no one, my wife, my daughter, my colleagues, could ever question again who I was. Back at the office, Ryan's arrogance bloomed like mold. He strutted into meetings quoting ideas he barely understood, took credit for innovations that were already months old, and the partners, though polite, began trading subtle glances, the kind that said doubt was germinating, and I sat quietly, sipping my coffee, logging everything. One afternoon, I accidentally bumped into Jessica from HR in the lobby, and when she asked how I was holding up, I said lightly, the funny thing about digital files is they always leave fingerprints. And then I walked away before she could ask what I meant, leaving her blinking, curious, planting the seed of my advantage without watering it yet, because timing is everything. That night I pulled up my secret cloud archive, scrolling through the neatly dated versions of the Hamilton strategy deck, each with metadata showing late-night saves, edits tracked to my laptop, proof undeniable, and I sat there in the glow of the screen thinking about how easy it would be to drop it all into HR's lap tomorrow, to clear my name in a single stroke, but then I thought about Ryan's smirk, about the laughter in the all-hands meeting, about Rachel's doubt and Emma's silence, and I knew clearing my name wasn't enough. I needed Ryan to choke on his own lies first, to make the firm not just see me as innocent, but see him as the cancer, and that required patience, cruelty even, a quality I never thought I had until someone tried to erase me. Around this time, an odd thing started happening. Colleagues who'd shunned me began slipping back into conversation. Small things like asking if I'd seen the Bulls game or if I wanted to join for coffee runs. And I realized they sensed Ryan's mask slipping, that office animals always smell weakness before it's spoken aloud, and it gave me a grim sort of hope, because people may betray you. But they also betray each other when tides turn, and loyalty is rarely about principle, it's about proximity to power. I decided then to bide my time, to let Ryan keep running, keep overreaching, because every empire of lies needs momentum to collapse under its own weight, and I was going to make sure he sprinted straight off the cliff. Still, nights were hard. Rachel stopped wearing her ring around the house, a silent protest, and Emma retreated into headphones and TikTok, avoiding me like I was some ghost haunting our living room, and I sat there in the dim light with coffee gone cold, whispering to myself the mantra that kept me sane. Truth doesn't need defenders, it just needs time. And though it sounded hollow at first, over weeks it hardened into resolve, because I knew time was on my side. The crack I'd been waiting for came late one Thursday. Ryan fired off an email blast to Hamilton with an updated deck, but in his rush to claim credit, he attached an early draft riddled with mistakes, a version I recognized immediately because it was one I'd scrapped at 2 a.m. weeks before. And the irony was delicious. He'd stolen from me so sloppily that he'd handed Hamilton my abandoned trash as if it were gold, and when Hamilton replied all with a scathing, "This is amateur work." "Daniel, was this your doing?" I felt the weight of opportunity slam into my chest. For a split second, I considered replying with the receipts, dropping the nuclear truth right there in the email thread. But no, I held back, my fingers hovering over the keys, because this wasn't just about winning, it was about ending Ryan in a way so undeniable that the partners themselves would beg me to stay, and that meant patience one more time. I closed my laptop, poured myself a bitter cup of coffee, and whispered to the empty kitchen, "Not yet." The morning after that email fiasco with Hamilton, the office buzzed like a beehive prodded with a stick, whispers darting from cubicle to cubicle, the kind of electric gossip that spreads faster than official memos ever could. And though no one said it directly, I could feel the shift, the suspicion that maybe the cracks in Ryan's polished facade weren't just isolated slip-ups, but symptoms of something rotten. And I sat at my desk sipping the same bitter coffee as always, pretending to scroll through a spreadsheet while inside my chest burned the urge to leap up and scream the truth. But instead I forced myself to smile politely, because nothing unnerves a liar more than the calm of the man he tried to bury. Ryan stormed into the office late, red-faced and loud, slamming his laptop bag on the desk and snapping at an intern about scheduling. his swagger suddenly brittle, like a drunk trying too hard to walk straight. And for the first time in weeks, I saw doubt flicker in the eyes of those around him. Colleagues who'd once hung on his every word now exchanging side glances that said, maybe we bet on the wrong horse. Still, HR kept their silence, the partners kept their distance, and life at home grew no easier. Rachel barely spoke to me except to ask about bills or Emma's schoolwork, her ring still absent, her warmth replaced with a simmering anger I couldn't diffuse, and one night she hit me with the question I dreaded most. Daniel, even if you prove you didn't steal his work, what if they don't care? What if they just move on without you? And I didn't have an answer because deep down I knew she was right. The corporate machine doesn't bleed for truth. It bleeds for profit, and if a scapegoat keeps the gears running, then truth can rot in the shadows. That realization should have crushed me, but instead it clarified things. I wasn't fighting just to prove innocence. I was fighting to make them care, to make the cost of ignoring me greater than the cost of facing the truth. And that meant Ryan's destruction had to be so undeniable it left no corporate wiggle room. The tension inside me built like a pressure cooker, and the only release was the gym, where I punished the weights until my muscles screamed, each rep a silent vow that I wouldn't let this story end with me, as the footnote. And every time I racked the bar and gasped for breath, I imagined Ryan gasping too, but on the rope of his own lies, and it fueled me. At work, his unraveling continued. He double-booked client calls, mixed up figures in a quarterly report, and worst of all, he started to get defensive in meetings, snapping at partners when they asked for clarification, and nothing kills a charmer's spell faster than desperation leaking through the cracks. I documented it all, quietly, like a court stenographer, every mistake cataloged, every slip-up cross-referenced against my cloud archive. And the folder I'd once called Seed Corn now grew fat with ammunition, ready to be unleashed when the moment turned perfect. But even as Ryan dug his own grave, I felt my home life sliding further into darkness. Emma stopped asking me to help with homework, stopped waiting for me to tuck her in, and one night I overheard her telling a friend on FaceTime, "Dad's in trouble at work. It's like he's not even here anymore." And those words gutted me more than any corporate betrayal ever could, because a man can lose his job and recover, but losing your child's faith feels like drowning in cement. I wanted to tell her, to tell them both, about the evidence I had, about the ace I was holding, but I couldn't because secrets are only powerful when kept close, and revealing it too early, even to the people I loved, risked leaking it out into the world before it could do its job. And so I swallowed the isolation, drank it like poison, because revenge requires sacrifice, and right now the sacrifice was being misunderstood by the people I cared for most. Ryan, oblivious to how close the walls were tightening, decided to double down. He scheduled a flashy client pitch for a new prospect, Burlington Manufacturing, and insisted on running point solo, bragging loudly in the break room about how he'd sealed the deal in under an hour. And I knew right then this was my opening, because Burlington wasn't just any prospect. It was one I'd quietly researched months before, compiling a detailed strategy doc that had never made it past my personal archive. And if Ryan somehow produced anything resembling it, the only way he could have gotten it was by stealing from me again. I stayed up late that night combing through my cloud files, pulling every draft, every note, carefully arranging them like dominoes, waiting for the perfect flick. And as I stared at the screen, bathed in the blue glow, I realized my entire life had funneled into this years of obsession with detail, of paranoia about backups, of loyalty misplaced and pride bruised dull, culminating in this slow, surgical trap I was laying, and a strange calm settled over me. The kind of calm that comes when a soldier realizes the battle isn't about rage anymore, it's about precision. The morning of the pitch, I watched Ryan stride into the conference room in his tailored suit, hair slicked back, smile sharp, and for a second I almost admired his audacity, because here was a man building his castle on sand and daring the tide to come in, but admiration quickly curdled into grim satisfaction, because I knew the tide was already rising. I sat quietly at my desk, coffee cooling beside me, and when the door closed behind him, I opened my Seed Corn folder one last time, double-checking every timestamp, every metadata line, every breadcrumb of truth that proved the work was mine, and I whispered to myself, almost. Because the thing about procedural justice, the kind built on contracts, emails, and digital trails, is that it doesn't roar, it whispers, and when it finally speaks, it leaves no room for denial, only silence, and Ryan had no idea how close that silence was. The Burlington pitch was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and the entire office seemed to thrum with nervous anticipation, because while Ryan strutted around bragging about how he'd land the account, everyone else quietly understood the stakes. Burlington wasn't just any client, it was a legacy contract, the kind of partnership that could stabilize shaky numbers for years. And failure here would ripple up to the partners' pockets in a way even Ryan couldn't smooth over with charm. And so, as the conference room filled with polished suits and careful smiles, I stayed at my desk, outwardly invisible, inwardly watching every move through the glass walls, my stomach tight but my mind razor sharp. Ryan began with his usual bravado, opening with a joke that drew polite chuckles, then flipping to a slick slide deck he clearly hadn't designed himself. Because in one glance I recognized the skeleton of my own Burlington strategy, gutted of nuance, painted with shallow buzzwords, and I felt that old cocktail of fury and vindication spike in my veins. But I forced myself to sit still. Because if there's one thing I'd learned, it's that revenge doesn't require rushing, it requires patience, letting the guilty man hang himself with the rope he stole. The clients listened politely at first, but I saw their expressions tighten as Ryan stumbled on key metrics, misquoted supply chain figures, and glossed over critical labor issues Burlington's board had been bleating about for months. Issues I had flagged meticulously in my notes, but which he, in his arrogance, had stripped out because they didn't fit his glossy narrative. And the silence in the room grew heavier with each fumble. One of Burlington's senior VPs leaned back, crossed his arms, and asked a pointed question about overseas compliance. Ryan blinked, bought time with a sip of water, then delivered an answer so thin it practically disintegrated in the air, and that was the moment the mood shifted, from mild curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. And I saw it happen, the exact second his grip on the room slipped. Outside the glass, my colleagues whispered, eyes darting between the client's frowns and Ryan's sweat-beaded forehead, and I felt a strange detachment, as if I were both the man watching and the man orchestrating, a dual presence that made my pulse steady even as Ryan stuttered. He plowed forward, oblivious to the quicksand under his feet, raising his voice, gesturing bigger, trying to win back control with sheer volume, but his desperation only made the cracks wider, and when the VP cut him off with, "I think we've heard enough for today," the words dropped like a gavel, final and cold. The room froze, Ryan's face drained, and the clients gathered their notes with brisk efficiency, promising to circle back internally, in a tone that meant exactly the opposite, and within minutes the conference room emptied, leaving Ryan standing in the fluorescent hush, blinking like a man who'd just been blindsided by a car he didn't see coming. I sat very still, heart pounding not from fear but from recognition. This was the beginning of the end, the moment where his shine dulled publicly, where whispers of incompetence would start crawling into the ears of those who mattered, and all I had to do was wait, because procedural justice doesn't require you to shout, it requires you to document, to align, to let the truth converge at the point where denial collapses. That afternoon, the office gossips feasted, replaying Ryan's blunders in hushed tones. But what mattered most was the partners' meeting called behind closed doors, voices muffled but urgent, and when Ryan emerged an hour later, jaw clenched, tie loosened, I knew the tide had turned, not fully, not decisively yet, but enough to weaken him, enough to prime the soil for the seed I'd been nurturing. At home, though, the victory felt hollow. Rachel barely looked up from her laptop when I walked in, and Emma was already asleep, and I found myself pacing the kitchen in the dark, torn between the satisfaction of watching Ryan's mask crack and the ache of realizing my own family's faith was slipping through my fingers. I wanted to tell Rachel, to say, "It's working, just wait, I have proof." But the words caught in my throat, because proof shared too early is proof diluted, and I needed her to see the result, not the preparation, so I poured myself a glass of water and swallowed the loneliness like medicine. Bitter, but necessary. The next morning, the whispers had sharpened into questions. Why did Ryan insist on handling the pitch alone? Why did his deck look suspiciously recycled? Why were Burlington's concerns brushed aside? And I fed those questions quietly, strategically, not with accusations but with subtle nudges, pointing colleagues toward documents, dates, inconsistencies, until suspicion became a current flowing beneath the surface. Still, Ryan fought back, doubling down on his arrogance, storming through the office with false bravado, cornering juniors and barking orders, spinning the narrative that Burlington was on the fence, and that he'd bring them around. But the more he insisted, the less people believed, because denial shouted always sounds weaker than truth whispered, and I could feel momentum shifting inch by inch toward me. The beauty of procedural justice is inevitability. When you build a case brick by brick, timestamp by timestamp, eventually the weight becomes too great for even the slickest liar to wriggle out from under, and I could sense we were close, so close, and the restraint it took not to press the detonator early nearly broke me. That night, alone in my study, I opened the folder one more time, scrolling through the evidence, the emails, the drafts, the metadata, all aligned like soldiers ready to march, and I whispered to the silence, "Soon." Because Ryan thought he was still in control, thought he could bluff his way through another week, another meeting, another deal, but he didn't realize he was already in check, the board arranged, the moves limited, the king cornered. And as I closed the laptop, I felt something rare and dangerous flicker inside me. Not just relief, not just anticipation, but hunger, the sharp edge of knowing the kill was near, and that when I struck, it wouldn't just expose him. It would bury him so deep no one would ever question who the real author, the real strategist, the real survivor had been all along. The day it began unraveling in the open was a Tuesday, gray skies pressing low against the city. The kind of weather that makes everything feel heavier, slower, as though the world itself knew something was about to break. And when I walked into the office, the atmosphere buzzed with a strange electricity, half anxious, half eager, because Burlington had officially withdrawn their interest, and the partners were furious, their anger ricocheting down the hallways like suppressed thunder, and Ryan, for the first time in years, wasn't swaggering but pacing, snapping at anyone who dared meet his eyes, clutching his phone as though a miracle callback might still come to save him, but everyone knew the deal was dead. I sat quietly at my desk, hands steady even as my heart thudded with anticipation, because today wasn't about Burlington anymore. Today was about alignment, about positioning the truth where it could no longer be ignored, and I had prepared for this moment with the patience of a watchmaker, every gear calibrated, every spring wound tight, ready to release. At 10 sharp, the partners called an emergency meeting, and the entire staff was ordered into the conference room, a rarity that made even the veterans uneasy. And as we filed in, the air thick with tension, I took a seat near the back, the vantage point of the observer, the orchestrator, while Ryan planted himself near the front, chin lifted in defiance that looked more brittle than bold. One of the senior partners began, voice clipped, outlining the financial cost of losing Burlington, the reputational damage, the troubling pattern of missed deliverables and client dissatisfaction, and with each word Ryan's shoulders stiffened, his face hardening into a mask of indignation. But masks only hold when no one dares touch them, and today, I knew they were about to be ripped away. When the partner asked Ryan to explain himself, he launched into his usual performance, blaming shifting client priorities, external market volatility, even hinting that someone inside the company had undermined him. And as those words left his mouth, I felt a wave of both disgust and satisfaction, because in that instant he set the stage for me, handed me the perfect opening, and all I had to do was step into it. My hand rose slowly, deliberately, and the room turned toward me, some eyes widening in surprise, because I never spoke in these meetings, never interrupted, but my voice when it came was steady, measured, not the tone of accusation but of contribution, as though I were merely clarifying, not detonating. With respect, I said, Burlington's concerns weren't about volatility. They were about specific compliance issues and labor risks, issues that were flagged in early drafts but removed from the final pitch deck. A ripple moved through the room, partners leaning forward, staff exchanging glances, and Ryan whipped his head toward me, eyes blazing, but before he could pounce, I pulled the first thread. "I can show the drafts if needed," I added, calm as stone, and that was it. The moment when the procedural weapon moved from my folder into the open air, undeniable, documented. The partner nodded sharply. "Show us." And so I did, projecting the documents, the timestamps, the metadata, each file an arrow aimed at Ryan's facade, each discrepancy a fracture in his narrative. And as the evidence stacked, the room's energy shifted palpably, from uncertainty to dawning recognition, from deference to suspicion, and Ryan began to unravel, first with interruptions, then with outright shouts of, "This is a setup." But the more he flailed, the more guilty he appeared, because nothing weakens a liar faster than paper trails, and I had them in abundance. His face flushed red, his voice cracked, and I realized with a cold clarity that this was the very humiliation he had once inflicted on me, the public dismantling, except now it wasn't a matter of opinion or charisma. It was fact, and fact has no sympathy. The partners pressed harder, their questions sharp, relentless, and Ryan's answers tangled into contradictions until he was practically choking on them. And I sat there, expression neutral, hands folded, heart hammering in a rhythm that matched the collapse unfolding before me. At last the senior partner leaned back, eyes narrowed, and said, "Ryan, we'll need to review this further. For now, step out." The command was firm, final, and Ryan froze as though struck, then sputtered a protest, but the silence that followed was more damning than any words. It was the silence of an entire room no longer willing to protect him. He stormed out, the door slamming behind him, and the conference room exhaled collectively, some in shock, some in barely disguised relief, and I knew then that the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, the room wasn't his stage anymore, it was mine. The partners turned back to me, their questions careful, their interest piqued, and I answered with the precision of a surgeon, never overselling, never dramatizing, simply presenting what I had, letting the truth shine in its own quiet brilliance, and with every nod, every scribbled note, I felt the scaffolding of my redemption rising around me. But that night, walking home beneath the still gray sky, the victory felt heavier than I expected, because as sweet as it was to watch Ryan's empire of arrogance crumble, I couldn't shake the image of his face when the mask finally slipped, not triumphant, not cunning, but frightened, like a man who realized too late that the world he'd built on lies was dissolving under his feet. And I wondered, as I reached my door, whether revenge is ever clean. Whether even when justice is procedural and precise, it doesn't still stain the one who wields it. Yet when Rachel looked up at me that evening, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes at the way my posture seemed taller, my silence steadier, I knew that stain was worth it, because tomorrow would bring the next step, the deeper fall, and I was ready to see it through. The days that followed that meeting were like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Not with the drama of a single implosion, but with the steady crumble of beams, one after another, until the whole structure sagged and bent under its own weight, and Ryan, once untouchable, suddenly found himself surrounded by silence where applause used to echo. The same colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes and rushed to echo his opinions now avoided his eye in the hallways, their greetings clipped, their loyalty evaporating like mist under sun. Because loyalty in an office like ours was always transactional, tethered to power, and power had shifted. I didn't need to push rumors. They grew like weeds on their own, fed by the scraps I had already laid bare. Whispers about manipulation, arrogance, doctored reports, each retelling sharper than the last. And though I kept my head down, never adding fuel, I didn't have to. People wanted to believe he was finished, because it suited them, and nothing is more dangerous than a herd scenting blood. Ryan's office, once a hub of activity, became a dead zone, door closed, blinds drawn, his assistants reassigned temporarily, which everyone knew meant permanently, and more than once I passed by to hear the muffled thud of him slamming his desk or the clipped edge of his voice on a phone call, trying to salvage connections that were already evaporating. The partners too shifted subtly, no longer inviting him into closed-door huddles, no longer deferring to his interruptions in meetings. Instead, their eyes lingered on me, gauging, testing, as though the balance was already recalibrating and they were deciding how much space to give me in the circle he once dominated. And yet, for all the satisfaction of seeing him crumble, I carried a strange disquiet at the edges of my chest, because destruction is rarely clean, and though Ryan had built his throne on arrogance and deceit, the sight of him now pale, twitching, anger spilling into desperation, was a reminder that revenge isn't just about toppling monsters, it's about turning people into ruins. And ruins, once human, carry a kind of ghost with them. Still, I pressed on because ghosts don't outweigh the living, and the living still remembered that ballroom night when he had carved me open with his words in front of everyone, when he had branded me as dead weight, and until that scar was balanced, I couldn't stop. So when the compliance officer quietly approached me after a meeting, asking for clarification on a few anomalies in Ryan's files, I gave them everything they needed. Not embellishing, not accusing, simply supplying truth with the quiet patience of a man watering seeds he knew would grow. And in less than a week, the investigation was formalized, Ryan's title stripped to interim, his access curtailed, and the halls buzzed with the story of his fall as though it were the office's favorite new show. The irony, of course, was that Ryan tried to lean on Rachel during this time, seeking her counsel, her sympathy, but by then she had begun to see him with new eyes, eyes that measured not just his power but his fear, and fear is rarely attractive. I noticed her laughter with him grew more strained, her defenses less automatic, and once, when she caught my glance across the break room, there was no longer disdain there but something closer to conflicted recognition, as though she realized she might have misjudged who was predator and who was prey. Still, I didn't push her. Rachel was her own battlefield, and my war wasn't with her. Not yet. It was with the man who had made humiliation his sport. I focused instead on tightening the noose, aligning myself quietly with allies who had once orbited Ryan. Not in overt alliance, but in quiet gestures, helpful insights, shared information, each connection a thread weaving into a safety net beneath me, so that when the final collapse came, I wouldn't just be the avenger, I'd be the replacement. And every night, walking home through the city's restless hum, I replayed the rhythm of it all in my mind. The way one revelation fed another. The way silence turned into whispers, turned into distance, turned into open rejection, until Ryan's name was no longer spoken with respect, but with a smirk, and I knew that soon, very soon, I wouldn't need to nudge the dominoes anymore. They would fall on their own. But even then, in those quiet hours, a darker thought lingered. Once he was gone, once the stage was mine, would the echo of his cruelty still live in me, reshaped into something new, or would I finally be free? I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew this much: his fall wasn't complete. Not until the mask he still wore in fragments was torn off entirely. Not until every last spectator saw him not as the brilliant strategist or charismatic leader, but as what he truly was: a coward cornered by truth. The final unraveling came not with fire or fury, but with a carefully orchestrated silence. The kind of silence that thickens a room before a storm. And I knew, as I walked into the quarterly review where the entire division would be gathered under the unforgiving glow of the chandelier, that this was the stage where everything would crystallize. Where Ryan's last mask would be torn away in front of the very people who once fed on his aura, because corporate downfall is never real until it is witnessed. And tonight there would be witnesses enough to etch it into memory. The room was humming with the low chatter of colleagues, pretending not to gossip, shuffling papers with the nervous energy of those who already knew something seismic was about to happen. And when Ryan finally entered, late, jaw-tight suit, slightly askew as though knotted by trembling hands, the chatter dipped into a hush, the collective gaze fastening onto him like a jury already leaning toward a verdict. He tried for his old swagger, the confident stride, the careless smile, but swagger without an audience is just a stumble in slow motion, and the weight of his isolation clung to him like a second skin. The managing partner, a man known for never raising his voice, cleared his throat with unusual solemnity, and in the silence that followed, every pen stilled, every breath held, and the words that came next sliced cleaner than any outburst could. In light of our findings, we have concluded that several key reports under Mr. Ryan's supervision were altered in ways that misrepresented our financial position. And while we do not attribute all responsibility directly to him, the patterns are undeniable. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't an accusation hurled across the room. It was worse. It was measured, undeniable, official, and Ryan's face drained as though someone had pulled a plug in the center of his chest. Papers were passed around, evidence highlighted, and I watched as colleagues who once leaned toward him now leaned away, chairs tilting subtly, bodies repositioning as though even proximity might stain them with guilt. Ryan stammered, tried to protest, his voice cracking in ways I had never heard, insisting on clerical errors, misunderstandings, but each plea only dug the hole deeper, his words ringing with desperation instead of authority. And I knew in that moment the transformation was complete. He was no longer the predator, no longer the towering figure who had carved me open in that ballroom. He was a man begging not to drown while the lifeboats sailed without him. And then it happened, the moment that cemented his exile. Rachel, who had been seated near the front, rose quietly, smoothing her skirt, and when she turned to face the partners, her voice was steady, clear, devastating in its simplicity. I can confirm that I was asked to sign off on figures I had not personally verified under pressure to expedite approvals, and when I hesitated, I was told it was in the company's best interest to move forward without delay. She didn't say his name, she didn't have to. The room filled in the blanks, and the silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Ryan turned to her, eyes wide, betrayal etched into every line of his face, but she didn't flinch, didn't meet his gaze, and in that small act she severed the last thread, tethering him to credibility. From there it was swift, the formal demotion, the announcement that an interim leader would be appointed, And when the partner's eyes swept across the room, they didn't settle on me outright but lingered just long enough to plant the seed in every observer's mind. A seed that whispered that the man who had quietly steadied the ship while Ryan flailed might soon be the one steering it permanently. As the meeting adjourned, the murmurs began, the sideways glances, the subtle recalibrations of allegiance, and Ryan, shoulders hunched, gathered his papers with trembling fingers. No one offering to help, no one reaching out, the once magnetic center now radioactive, abandoned. I lingered behind, not out of pity but out of purpose, watching as he shuffled toward the door, the same door through which he had once strode with effortless command. And when his hand faltered on the handle, I felt the weight of everything, of the ballroom humiliation, of the months of patient maneuvering, of the whispered alliances and quiet revelations. And I knew this was it, the balance restored, the ledger evened. Yet as he stepped out, swallowed by the indifferent hallway, a flicker of something unexpected rippled through me, not triumph, not relief, but a strange, hollow ache, because in destroying him I had become a mirror of the cruelty I once despised, and the question lingered whether I had risen above him or simply replaced him in kind. Still, when I left that room, colleagues met my eyes with new deference, voices softer, smiles more eager, and I understood that whether or not the hollow would ever fill, I had won the war, and in the world we lived in, sometimes that was the only truth that mattered. Victory, when it finally arrived, did not come in a trumpet blast or a parade but in the slow rearrangement of everyday details, the subtle but unmistakable shift in how the world moved around me. And it was in those small shifts that I realized Ryan's fall had become my ascent, though the crown I now wore felt heavier than I ever imagined. Colleagues who once overlooked me now sought my approval with the eager eyes of people sensing a tide they couldn't afford to fight. Invitations to closed-door meetings slipped quietly across my desk. Partners began asking for my perspective on issues that had once passed me by entirely, and even Rachel, though she never directly addressed me in front of others, allowed her gaze to linger longer than before. Not with the disdain that used to sting, but with the uneasy recognition of someone recalculating their entire understanding of another human being. It should have felt sweet, intoxicating even, to walk through the same hallways that had once been battlegrounds for my dignity, and to feel the air bend differently, charged not with ridicule, but with expectation. But the truth was more complicated, because along with respect came whispers, responsibilities, calculations I hadn't yet learned how to carry, and I often found myself awake late into the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had merely traded humiliation for another kind of weight, one that might prove just as crushing. There were moments, too, when I saw Ryan in my mind, not the arrogant tyrant who had carved me open in front of a ballroom, but the broken figure hunched over his papers, abandoned by allies, eyes wide with disbelief as the floor gave way beneath him. And in those moments a pang of doubt gnawed at me, whispering that I had not just unmasked a fraud but annihilated a man. An annihilation, even when deserved, leaves blood on the hands of the one who wields it. Yet the world moved on as it always does. And soon the empty chair at meetings where Ryan once sat became a new kind of fixture, a reminder of how quickly power can be erased, how memory bends around the void. And when the managing partner finally announced that I would be stepping into an expanded role to provide stability during this transition, I saw in the eyes around me not just approval but relief, the relief of people eager to forget the chaos, eager to anchor themselves to a new name, a new story. And in that moment, whether I liked it or not, I became the story. The irony, of course, was that my rise was built not on dazzling brilliance or sudden transformation, but on the quiet endurance of humiliation, the patience to turn shame into strategy, and though no one would ever see that, though they would tell themselves I had simply stepped into a void left by another man's mistakes, I knew better. I knew that every glance of respect I received had been purchased with the memory of that night when I stood exposed under the chandelier, branded as nothing, and every nod of approval was a kind of repayment, even if they never understood what debt they owed. Still, in the quiet moments when the applause of daily victories faded, I found myself haunted by a question I could not shake. Had I avenged myself, or had I become the very thing I once despised, a man who lived not to build but to destroy? There were no easy answers, only the steady rhythm of days turning into weeks, weeks into months, and with each step upward, with each new responsibility, I felt both the satisfaction of having remade my place in the world and the unease of carrying a ghost that would not leave, the ghost of Ryan, Yes, but also the ghost of the man I used to be, the man who still wondered whether revenge could ever truly set a soul free. The strangest thing about victory, I learned, was how quickly it became invisible to everyone else, how the headlines faded, the whispers died down, and the very people who had once pointed fingers at Ryan and then praised me simply slipped back into their routines, their lives turning again to personal dramas, new office rumors, the endless churn of deadlines, as though none of it had ever happened. And I would sit at my desk sometimes, late in the evening when the building had emptied out, staring at the faint reflection of my own face in the darkened window, asking myself whether I had simply traded one kind of irrelevance for another, because power, for all its allure, is still just another mask people wear when they want to believe they matter. What unsettled me most wasn't the quiet. It was how easy it became to justify things I would have once sworn I hated, cutting someone out of a meeting because I didn't trust their loyalty, sharpening my tone in ways that sounded eerily like Ryan's old tirades, or catching myself withholding praise because I wanted someone to prove themselves just a little more, and each time I did it, I told myself it was necessary. Part of maintaining order, but deep down I could hear the faint echo of Ryan's voice. And the worst part was that it didn't sound foreign anymore, it sounded like me. I tried to convince myself I was different because my motives were cleaner, because I had been forged in humiliation rather than privilege. But when I replayed certain moments, when I saw the way an intern flinched at my sharp correction, or how a colleague avoided my eye after I shut down their idea in front of others, I realized I had become fluent in a language I once despised. And fluency doesn't come by accident, it comes by choice. Nights became my battlefield, insomnia wrapping around me like barbed wire, and I would lie awake staring at the ceiling fan turning in its endless circle, remembering the look in Ryan's eyes during his collapse, that disbelieving horror, and wondering if someday it would be me sitting in that chair, undone not by some enemy's brilliance, but by my own reflection staring back at me. Whiskey became a ritual then. Not in celebration, but in defense, a shield against the gnawing quiet, and I found myself leaning heavier on it than I wanted to admit, pouring 2 fingers into a glass, watching the amber swirl under the kitchen light, telling myself I deserved it for surviving what I had survived. But the truth was, it didn't feel like survival anymore. It felt like maintenance, like keeping a machine running past its expiration date. Sometimes I thought about reaching out to old friends, guys I'd lost touch with over the years, the ones who had seen me before all this, before Ryan, before the ballroom humiliation, before the chase for titles and revenge had hollowed something out of me. But every time I drafted a message or hovered over a number in my phone, I stopped, paralyzed by the fear that if I heard my own voice reflected back through someone who knew me then, I wouldn't recognize myself anymore, and maybe they wouldn't either. Work kept me insulated, always something urgent, always another problem to solve. And the higher I climbed, the less I could admit weakness without risking the same kind of predation that had nearly destroyed me. So I wore the mask tighter, smiled at the right times, delivered the right jokes in meetings, even as the hollow behind my ribs deepened. If there was one truth I couldn't escape, it was this. Revenge doesn't close a wound. It carves a new one where the scar should be, and though the world may applaud the performance of justice, only the performer knows the cost, and mine was beginning to feel unbearable. It was supposed to end cleanly, the storybook version of revenge where the villain falls, the hero rises, and the credits roll. But life has no clean edges, and I should have known the universe wasn't done twisting the knife because one night long after the office had gone dark, when I was nursing another pour of whiskey at my desk, I opened an anonymous email that froze the blood in my veins. The subject line blank, the body a single line. Check the board minutes, you missed something. And attached was a file that contained a snippet of an audio recording my voice, clear as day, speaking to a junior analyst, saying things I barely remembered but damning nonetheless, phrases that, pulled out of context, could make me sound manipulative, calculating, predatory, even. And suddenly the floor tilted beneath me because I knew the game I had played against Ryan had left trails of my own, and someone had found them. For 2 days I barely slept, combing through old emails, contracts, call logs, looking for what they meant by the minutes, until finally it clicked. Ryan, in his final board meeting before he was ousted, had slipped in an amendment, buried in jargon, that created a clause allowing deferred accountability for executive conduct, a clause so innocuous no one had noticed, not even me, and the twist was brutal. The very technicality I had once used to destroy him had now become the fuse under my own seat, a time bomb waiting for someone patient enough to light it. I wanted to believe it was Ryan himself orchestrating this from exile, but word was he'd retreated to Arizona, living in some gated desert community, reduced to golfing and pretending he hadn't been shattered. So it had to be someone else, maybe a protege of his, maybe someone who wanted to remind me the crown was always borrowed, never owned. But here's the part that still haunts me, the second twist, the one I never saw coming. The anonymous email wasn't from an enemy. It was from someone inside, one of the analysts I had once pushed too hard, too fast, who wanted to warn me that if I didn't clean my trail, someone else would bury me with it. And suddenly I saw the reflection of my entire journey in one cruel stroke. How Ryan had been undone not by malice alone, but by a culture of fear he had cultivated. How I had risked becoming the same kind of tyrant, and how the only thing that had spared me in that moment was a sliver of loyalty I hadn't entirely poisoned. I remember sitting there, the glass sweating in my hand, staring at the company logo glowing faintly on the wall, and I laughed. Not a joyful laugh, but a jagged, broken sound, because it hit me that revenge had given me the power I craved, but only by putting me on the same tightrope Ryan had walked, and sooner or later, every man slips. So I made a choice that night, not out of nobility, not because I suddenly grew wise, but because I couldn't stomach becoming the thing I had once destroyed. I called the analyst in, thanked them, and quietly started dismantling the little empires of fear I had built, brick by brick, pulling people into rooms to apologize, easing my grip on control, letting trust trickle back into the cracks I had sealed. And though it felt weak at first, humiliating even, I came to realize it was the only way to keep the ghost of Ryan from devouring me. And here's where the poetic justice landed, almost too perfectly to be real. Months later, during a quarterly review, I brought out the old whiskey glass I'd kept from the night of my humiliation. The same one I had raised, shattered inside, while Ryan smirked across the ballroom, and I placed it on the conference table as a prop, telling the team that if anyone ever caught me becoming what Ryan had been, they had permission to shatter that glass in front of me as a reminder. And the room laughed, a real laugh, not the forced kind, and for the first time since that night I felt something close to freedom. They never did break the glass, though sometimes a colleague would tap it with a knuckle, as a joke when I got too sharp, and I would nod, grateful, because that small symbolic object, the one that had once embodied my shame, had become the guardrail that kept me from falling into the same abyss. So if there's a final philosophy I can offer, it's this. Betrayal doesn't just reveal who your enemies are. It reveals the parts of yourself you're willing to sacrifice to beat them. And the real revenge, the only kind that lasts, isn't proving them wrong. It's refusing to become them. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.